My name is Clara, and I am 27 years old. For 5 long years, my parents forced me to be the unpaid maid and full-time nanny for my older sister. My father told me it was my family duty. I scrubbed their floors, raised my sister's toddlers, and cleaned my father's commercial real estate office late at night without seeing a single paycheck. I never complained. I just kept my head down and did the work. Then on Thanksgiving, with the whole family gathered around the table, I reached into my bag and slid a thick manila folder right under my father's plate. It was a binding invoice for $85,000 for services rendered. When he flipped to the last page and saw his own signature on every single timesheet tying him to a trap he built himself, he gasped and dropped his wine glass. Before I tell you what happened when the legal reality hit him, please take a moment to like and subscribe to Cold Tea Stories, but only if you genuinely enjoy the story. And while you are here, drop your age and where you are listening from in the comments. I love knowing who is tuning in. Now, let me take you to the dining room in Brentwood, Tennessee, where my father thought he was the smartest man in the room. The house smelled of roasted turkey, sage stuffing, and quiet resentment. I stood near the sideboard with a folded linen napkin draped over my forearm, waiting to clear the salad plates. In this house, my age and identity had long ago been dissolved into a single functional title: the help. At the head of the mahogany table sat my father, David. He swirled a glass of red wine, lecturing the room about the commercial real estate market. His voice held the practiced, resonant cadence of a man who assumed every syllable he spoke was vital. To his right sat my mother, Helen, nodding along while leaning over to cut the meat on my older sister Bethy's plate. Bethany was 30, fresh off a divorce and scrolling through her phone. Her twin toddlers, seated across from her, were staging a quiet revolt, smearing mashed potatoes onto the upholstery of Helen's antique dining chairs. "Clara, get a wet rag," Helen murmured, not looking up from Bethy's plate. I didn't move. Helen glanced up, her brow furrowing. "Clara?" I untucked the linen napkin from my arm and set it neatly beside the gravy boat. For 5 years I had fetched the rags. I had scrubbed the baseboards, organized David's filing cabinets, picked up Bethy's kids from preschool, and managed the logistical nightmare of my family's lives. I had done it under the guise of pitching in, bound by an unspoken debt. David paused, his monologue irritated by the interruption. He set his wine glass down. "Did you hear your mother? The kids are making a mess." I walked over to my tote bag, resting near the entryway. I unzipped it, reaching past my wallet and my car keys. My fingers brushed the smooth, thick cardstock of a manila folder. I pulled it out. "I am not getting a rag, Dad," I said. My voice was steady. It didn't tremble. I had spent 3 years preparing for this exact evening. The adrenaline had burned off months ago, leaving only a cold, clinical focus. I walked back to the table and stood beside his chair. I placed the manila folder on the mahogany surface and slid it inches forward until the edge bumped the base of his wineglass. David stared at it. "What is this?" "If it is a resume, I told you my firm isn't hiring right now." "It is not a resume," I said. "It is an invoice." Bethany looked up from her phone. Helen stopped cutting the turkey. David let out a short, patronizing breath through his nose. He flipped the folder open, ready to dismiss whatever childish grievance he assumed I had typed up. I watched his eyes scan the top of the page. It was a standard business-to-business billing statement. The header bore the name of my registered company, Apex Domestic Solutions. Below it sat an itemized ledger, chronicling 5 years of administrative and domestic labor rendered to his real estate firm and his subsidiary rental properties. The billing terms were net 90. "You are billing me?" David scoffed, looking at the first page. "For doing chores? You live under my roof, Clara. This is a joke." "Turn to the last page, Dad." He flipped the thick stack of papers, the sound loud in the sudden quiet of the room. His eyes landed on the total at the bottom right corner, $85,000. The smirk vanished from his lips. He blinked hard, leaning closer to the paper. His gaze dropped below the total. There, neatly aligned in black ink, were 52 individual signatures. His signatures. "You signed the timesheets every Sunday," I reminded him quietly. "You filed those exact hours with your accountant to claim administrative overhead and reduce your corporate tax burden. You used my labor to write off your taxes." David's face drained of color. The wine sloshed slightly in his glass as his hand gripped the edge of the table. He was a man who understood the IRS better than he understood his own children. He knew exactly what he was looking at. It wasn't a tantrum. It was a legally binding contract, backed by his own fraudulent tax filings. "You either owe my company $85,000, I said, or you committed federal tax evasion. Happy Thanksgiving." To understand the absolute silence gripping that Thanksgiving table, you must look back at the noise of my greatest failure. 5 years earlier, I was 22 years old and hauling damp cardboard boxes up the carpeted stairs of my childhood home. A software logistics startup holding every penny of my savings had filed for bankruptcy the week prior. Walking back into my teenage bedroom tasted like ash. My pride was bruised, my bank account sat at zero, and the eviction notice from my city apartment still burned in my memory. Helen stood in the doorway, watching me unpack a cheap desk lamp with a sympathetic smile, adjusting the pearl stud in her ear. David leaned against the doorframe, checking his gold watch, treating my return like a minor tenant issue rather than a family reunion. They offered me my old mattress and a warm roof, but that generosity disguised a psychological trap. I just lacked the experience to spot the steel jaws waiting beneath the bait. Down the street, my older sister was tearing her own life apart, in a much more expensive fashion. Bethany had finalized a bitter divorce 3 months prior, securing a substantial alimony payout. David, forever playing the savior to his favorite child, moved her into one of his premier rental townhouses. She had 2 toddlers, 0 income, and a relentless talent for manufacturing crises. The proposition occurred over a Tuesday meatloaf dinner. David pushed his plate aside, steepling his fingers to outline the situation with the cold precision of a lease agreement. I possessed no job, and he controlled a spare room. The roof over my head came with a small caveat. He needed reliable help, and Bethany required stability. Helen reached across the table, covering my hand with her cold fingers. She framed the arrangement as a beautiful family initiative. Bethany needed help managing the boys, and David's commercial real estate office required after-hours maintenance. It was just pitching in, she promised with a soft tilt of her head. A temporary bridge, until I found my footing in the corporate world again. Guilt makes a person remarkably pliable. Bankrupt and terrified of sleeping in my car, I grabbed the lifeline they dangled over the table. I nodded, agreeing to trade my autonomy for their approval. The logic felt sound in my exhausted mind. I would earn my keep, save some cash, and move out within 6 months. That was the lie I told myself. The reality of my new existence hit me like a physical blow by the second week. Waking up at dawn became my new normal. I drove my beat-up sedan to Bethy's pristine townhouse, letting myself in before the sun even cleared the horizon. The chaos greeted me at the door. I navigated sticky hardwood floors, stepping over expensive plastic toys to make oatmeal for 2 screaming toddlers. Bethany would sleep until 10 o'clock in the morning. When she finally emerged, wearing designer silk pajamas funded by our father, she rarely offered a thank you. She treated my presence like a municipal service, handing me dirty laundry and complaining about her exhausting social schedule. I spent my mornings scrubbing pureed fruit off the walls and my afternoons breaking up temper tantrums while Bethany went to Pilates. Evenings belonged to David. By 7 p.m. I was unlocking the glass doors of his downtown firm. The smell of industrial cleaner burned my nostrils as I pushed a heavy janitorial cart down the carpeted hallways. I emptied overflowing trash cans, scrubbed coffee stains out of the break room rug, and sanitized the client bathrooms. David would sometimes work late, reviewing property deeds in his corner office. He ignored my presence entirely as I vacuumed around his leather chair, stepping over extension cords and dusting his mahogany bookshelves. He never offered to buy me dinner. He never thanked me for staying past midnight. I was a ghost, operating a mop, invisible until something was dirty. Months bled into a grueling year. The temporary bridge became a permanent cage forged by my own shame. Every time I mentioned looking for a real job, Helen would sigh, adjusting her posture to convey quiet disappointment. She would list Bethy's recent struggles, reminding me how much the boys relied on my stability. David would remind me about the rising cost of rent in the city, calculating my grocery consumption out loud to ensure I felt the financial burden of my existence. They did not use chains to keep me there. They used my fear of failure. I scrubbed baseboards until my knuckles bled, believing I had to earn my right to breathe their air. Desperate for stability, I allowed them to rewrite my worth. I became Bethy's unpaid nanny and David's free after-hours janitor. swallowing my ambition to keep the peace. I did not realize that in their eyes, my startup failure had revoked my status as a daughter. I was no longer a person with a future. I had become an appliance. You do not ask a refrigerator about its career goals, and you do not pay a vacuum cleaner a living wage. They expected me to function silently in the background, keeping their lives spotless, while my own withered on the vine. The physical exhaustion was punishing, but the psychological toll began to rot my spirit. I spent hours pushing a sponge across commercial tile, watching my 20s evaporate under fluorescent office lights. I watched Bethany buy a new luxury SUV, while I begged David for $20 to put gas in my 10-year-old sedan. He scoffed at the request, tossing a crisp $20 bill onto his desk without looking up from his paperwork. "You have zero overhead, Clara," he muttered, shuffling a stack of property deeds. "Do not be greedy." I picked up the bill, feeling the coarse paper against my calloused thumb. I stared at the man who owned half the commercial blocks in town, realizing he viewed my poverty as a convenient asset. A financially independent daughter could walk away. A broke daughter had to stay and clean the toilets. But David was a man obsessed with profit margins, constantly hunting for a new loophole to exploit. He viewed his business taxes as a game he was determined to win. That obsession with squeezing every dime out of his corporate filings would soon become the very weapon I needed. A few weeks after the gas money incident, David called me into his office. He sat behind his massive desk, holding a blank ledger and looking incredibly pleased with himself. He laid out a new plan to optimize his accounting, demanding that I track my daily chores on an official company timesheet. The trap he thought he was building for the government was about to become the snare that would catch him instead. By the second year, my temporary pitching in had calcified into a rigid, inescapable sentence of permanent servitude. Working 40 hours a week without a single paycheck became the crushing baseline of my existence. Waking up in the dark, I drove my sputtering sedan straight to Bethy's rental townhouse to manage the morning rush. My older sister was currently navigating a phase of finding herself, which mostly involved attending pricey yoga retreats, consulting obscure life coaches, and sipping expensive green smoothies while I scraped dried oatmeal off her kitchen floor. Sifting through piles of discarded designer workout gear, I constantly calculated the exorbitant cost of her lifestyle against my zero bank balance. She treated my presence like a municipal utility, tossing dirty laundry in my direction while complaining about her exhausting social schedule. Bethany would leave for hours, returning only to drop off shopping bags before heading out to dinner with friends. Finishing the grueling morning shift, I transitioned to my evening duties at the commercial real estate firm. Scrubbing David's corner office required meticulous, agonizing attention to detail. Leaving a single streak on his glass conference table guaranteed a passive-aggressive text message the next morning. My knees ached from kneeling on rough industrial carpet, fighting coffee stains left behind by his wealthy clients. Smelling of harsh chemical bleach, I emptied overflowing trash cans and sanitized client bathrooms long after the sun went down. Exhaustion settled into my bones, a constant dull throb reminding me of my invisible worthless status. I watched my peers advance in their careers on social media, securing promotions and buying homes, while I spent my Friday nights scraping chewing gum off baseboards. The breaking point for my patience arrived in late October when my ancient car finally died in a grocery store parking lot. Smoke billowed from the hood, signaling a blown transmission that cost more to repair than the vehicle was worth. Pushing a metal shopping cart through the freezing rain, I realized I needed a way to transport Bethy's toddlers to their exclusive preschool. Swallowing my pride, I decided to approach my father for help, hoping he might recognize the practical necessity of my request. Finding him in his expansive home study, I watched him review a stack of quarterly profit reports on his polished oak desk. Clearing my throat, I requested a small, reasonable monthly stipend, just enough to lease a reliable used vehicle and cover basic insurance. My voice stayed low, trying to project calm professionalism rather than desperate begging. I explained that driving Bethy's children required safe transportation, framing the request as a logistical business expense rather than a personal favor. David lowered his gold-rimmed reading glasses, staring at me as if I had requested a controlling equity stake in his company. Snapping the financial folder shut, he leaned back in his plush leather chair, crossing his arms over his chest. "You have zero overhead, Clara," he scoffed, waving a hand to encompass the sprawling suburban mansion surrounding us. "Your mother buys the expensive groceries and I cover the exorbitant utility bills. Do not be greedy." Dismissing me with a flick of his wrist, he returned to his paperwork. Swallowing a lump of humiliation, I walked away, retreating to my childhood bedroom. His twisted definition of greed fascinated me. A multi-millionaire demanding free, back-breaking labor from his bankrupt daughter viewed himself as a benevolent patron, while the daughter asking for basic transportation money was the selfish parasite. Without a car, my isolation became complete, forcing me to rely on Helen to drive me to Bethy's house every single morning. Despite calling me greedy, David possessed a relentless, unyielding obsession with his own profit margins. Paying federal taxes felt like a personal insult to his intelligence, a literal theft of his hard-earned wealth. He viewed the IRS as an opponent to outsmart, constantly hunting for creative accounting loopholes. A few weeks after the transmission incident, he cornered me in the kitchen with a fresh, unsettling proposition that would entangle me in his financial web. Slapping a stack of blank formal company timesheets onto the granite island, he outlined a brilliant new strategy. He wanted me to track every single hour I spent cleaning his corporate headquarters and managing Bethy's chaotic household. Tracing a manicured finger down the date column, he explained the hidden mechanism of his plan. He intended to run my logged hours through his business accounting software, classifying the unpaid labor as property management and administrative overhead. A smug, victorious grin stretched across his face, highlighting the deep wrinkles around his eyes. "Submitting these records helps me with the tax man," he boasted, pouring himself a steaming cup of black coffee. "In return for logging your tedious tasks, you get to keep living in my house rent-free." He tapped the top sheet with his pen, instructing me to fill out the first row as an example, ensuring I used the correct corporate billing codes. The sheer audacity of the scheme washed over me in cold waves. Bethany did not work for his firm in any capacity, yet he planned to write off her private childcare as a legitimate corporate business expense. My janitorial duties at the office provided actual value to the firm, but funneling those hours through fake payroll records without dispensing a real paycheck constituted a massive legal liability. He was drafting fraudulent documents to lower his tax bracket, and he needed my signature to make the illusion look authentic to an auditor. I recognized the arrangement as borderline tax fraud, a dangerous game of financial manipulation. He was weaponizing my physical exhaustion to line his own pockets, extracting a lucrative government subsidy based on a phantom wage. Standing in the immaculate kitchen, staring at the pristine blank ledger, I knew I should refuse the offer. Walking out the front door and sleeping on a friend's lumpy couch felt like the only moral choice remaining. Taking part in his scheme meant crossing a line from victim to active participant. My confidence, however, had been ground into fine dust over the past 24 months. The tech startup failure still haunted my waking thoughts, whispering that I lacked the basic intelligence to survive in the competitive real world. Terrified of being kicked out with nowhere to go, lacking even a vehicle to sleep in, I caved to the suffocating pressure. Picking up a blue pen, I made the ultimate coward's choice, signing my name on the dotted line. Every Sunday evening became a toxic ritual of complicity. Sitting alone at the dining room table, I filled out the timesheets, documenting every load of laundry folded and every toilet scrubbed. Handing the signed paperwork over to my father, I cemented my tragic role in his sketchy accounting practices. I watched him file the documents away in his leather briefcase, knowing I was actively participating in my own financial starvation. He would nod in approval, verifying the hours matched his desired deductions before dismissing me for the night. The trap closed tighter around my neck, securing my place at the very bottom of the family hierarchy. Selling my labor for a free room trapped me in a vicious cycle of dependency, leaving no mental energy to search for a viable exit strategy. Working 40 hours for zero pay meant I could never save a deposit for a cheap apartment or buy a replacement vehicle. I assumed things could not possibly get worse, believing I had already hit absolute bottom. But settling for the bottom only invites ruthless people to step on your spine. The real cost of my quiet submission had yet to reveal itself, lurking just around the corner in the form of a rare, life-changing opportunity. A tiny glimmer of professional hope would soon present itself to me, offering a potential escape route from the endless chores. That fragile chance would be crushed by the relentless weight of family obligation, setting the stage for a missed phone call that would finally snap my patience in half. The wake-up call did not arrive with a dramatic screaming match in the living room. It came in the form of a missed video call, a blinking notification that sealed my fate. For weeks, I had been nurturing a fragile secret. Late at night, using the spotty internet connection in my childhood bedroom, I submitted applications to entry-level corporate jobs across Nashville. A mid-size logistics firm finally responded. Passing the initial phone screening felt like breathing fresh oxygen for the first time in 2 years. I aced the technical assessment, proving my brain still functioned outside the realm of scrubbing grout. The hiring manager scheduled a final round video interview for a Tuesday morning at 9 a.m. Securing that junior accounting role meant a steady salary, a signed lease on a small apartment, and a permanent exit from my father's house. Tuesday morning arrived crisp and clear. Wearing a pressed white blouse I had ironed the night before, I sat at my small desk, practicing interview answers. At 7 a.m., the heavy oak front door slammed shut downstairs. Footsteps echoed through the foyer, followed by the shrill, demanding cries of my 2 nephews. Walking out onto the landing, I looked down over the banister. Bethany stood in the hallway, wearing oversized sunglasses and holding a designer coffee cup. She dropped 2 heavy diaper bags onto the pristine hardwood floor, declaring an absolute emergency. Her version of a crisis usually involved a minor inconvenience like a chipped manicure or a delayed package delivery. Today, she announced an urgent need for a self-care day, citing the overwhelming stress of being a single mother. Our mother glided out of the kitchen, tying the belt of her cashmere robe. Helen did not question the abrupt dumping of the children. She merely rubbed Bethy's shoulder, validating her exhaustion, praising her resilience. Watching them coddle each other, panic seized my chest. Rushing down the stairs, I explained the conflict. My voice pitched up, tight with anxiety, as I reminded Helen about the final round interview. I begged for just 1 hour of uninterrupted quiet, pleading with my mother to watch the toddlers until 10 a.m. Helen waved a manicured hand in my direction, swatting away my career aspirations like a pesky mosquito. Bethany is navigating a very fragile transition right now, she murmured, picking up a crying toddler. Her mental health takes priority today, Clara, so just reschedule your little meeting. Corporate hiring managers do not reschedule final round interviews because a candidate's sister needs to visit a day spa. Explaining this fact to Helen proved useless. She turned her back, carrying the younger boy into the kitchen to find a snack. Bethany blew a kiss toward the air, turning on her heel and walking out the door, leaving me stranded with the older boy pulling at my slacks. The clock ticked closer to 9 o'clock. Desperation clawed at my throat as I tried to corral the children into the den. Turning on a cartoon, I prayed for a sliver of peace. The universe, however, possesses a cruel sense of humor. 5 minutes before the interview, the older toddler complained of a stomachache. Before I could grab a plastic bucket from the kitchen, he emptied the contents of his breakfast onto Helen's expensive Persian rug. The pungent smell of acidic fruit and half-digested milk filled the room. The child started wailing, terrified by his own mess. Hearing the commotion, Helen shouted from the other room, commanding me to clean the vintage fibers before the stain set. Rushing to grab a bucket of hot water and a bristled brush, I heard a faint chime echoing down the stairs. My laptop was ringing. The hiring panel waited in a virtual meeting room, looking for the junior accountant who promised punctuality and professionalism. Kneeling on the floor, soaking a sponge in soapy water, I listened to the chime repeat over and over. I could not leave a crying, sick child standing in a puddle of vomit. I scrubbed the wool fibers, tears blurring my vision, matching the rhythm of the ringing computer. The chiming eventually stopped, replaced by a suffocating silence. I lost the job. An automated rejection email arrived 3 hours later, noting my failure to appear. Scrubbing the rug, making soup for the boys, and folding laundry filled the rest of my miserable day. A hollow, aching grief settled into my ribs, a physical manifestation of my trapped reality. Evening approached, bringing David home from his commercial firm. He walked through the front door, shrugging off his tailored suit jacket, and tossing a stack of mail onto the entryway table. Stepping into the hallway, I attempted to express the magnitude of my loss. My voice cracked, raw with unshed tears, explaining how the morning chaos cost me a real salary and a chance at independence. Sorting through bills and corporate letters, David did not even bother to look up. He treated my devastation like background noise, an annoying hum distracting him from his priorities. "You are living in my house, eating the food I purchase," he stated, his tone flat and unyielding. "Family comes first, Clara, and you pitch in when your sister needs you." Snapping an envelope open, he walked past me, heading straight for his study. The conversation was over. Standing alone in the dim hallway, The grief festering inside me began to curdle into something else. That night, I lay rigid on my old mattress, staring up at the glow-in-the-dark stars glued to the ceiling. The events of the day replayed in my mind, shifting my perspective. A chilling realization washed over my tired brain. They did not want me to get on my feet. If I secured a corporate accounting job, I would pack my bags and sign a lease. Leaving the house meant Bethany would lose her on-call nanny. David would lose his late-night janitor. He would lose the fraudulent administrative overhead he filed with his taxes every quarter. My failure served as the vital engine powering their comfort. My persistent obedience was not earning their love or repairing my broken status. Compliance only guaranteed my permanent subjugation. As long as I sought their approval, they would keep me crawling on my knees, cleaning up their messes and thanking them for the privilege. The desperate desire to win back my family evaporated in the dark room, leaving behind a cold, clinical clarity. I stopped crying. Wiping my face with the back of my hand, I pulled a notebook from the nightstand. The rules of engagement had changed. If they viewed my labor as a disposable corporate asset, I needed to start acting like a ruthless vendor. Formulating a concrete escape plan required careful maneuvering, legal protection, and a whole lot of fine print. Walking downstairs the next morning required a meticulously constructed mask of defeat. Screaming matches achieve nothing against people who believe they own your existence. Throwing a tantrum over the missed accounting interview would only result in a swift eviction notice, leaving me homeless and penniless on the streets of Nashville. Playing the role of the compliant, broken daughter, I packed a large trash bag full of designer clothes from my past corporate life. I folded tailored blazers, silk blouses, and expensive pencil skirts, stripping away the last physical remnants of the ambitious woman who had tried to build a tech startup. Driving my sputtering sedan to an upscale consignment shop downtown, I sought untraceable capital. The store clerk inspected my garments with a critical eye, checking the designer labels and the quality of the stitching. Handing over $300 in crisp bills, the cashier completed the transaction with a polite nod. Walking out into the humid afternoon air, the cash in my palm felt like a weapon. Financial leverage always begins with seed money, and I needed professional guidance to turn my labor into a blade. Scheduling a consultation with a local tax attorney cost $250 up front. We met at a quiet corner table inside a bustling coffee shop near the county courthouse. The lawyer was a pragmatic man in his late 50s, stirring cream into his mug while reviewing the blank chore logs my father had provided. Taking a slow sip of his drink, he laid out the unvarnished reality of commercial tax codes. Corporate write-offs for administrative overhead require a legitimate third-party vendor to pass government scrutiny. Claiming a dependent family member as an unpaid employee constitutes a massive audit risk for any commercial real estate firm. The attorney tapped a manicured finger against the paper, explaining the underlying legal mechanics of commercial billing. Converting these domestic chore logs into formal business invoices would completely invert the power dynamic between my father and me. David needed to be billed by an independent contractor to claim his beloved deduction legally. Creating a formal business entity and submitting properly formatted invoices would change everything. His physical signature would transform a toxic domestic dispute into a binding commercial contract. Sliding the blank timesheet back across the cafe table, the attorney warned me about the sheer risk of the operation. Trapping a wealthy real estate developer required flawless, patient execution. A single formatting error or verbal slip could alert my father to the scheme, resulting in immediate retaliation. Thanking the lawyer, I pocketed his business card and finished my cold coffee. The legal framework was solid, but I still needed to build the actual cage. Returning to the suffocating confines of my childhood bedroom, I opened my laptop and went to work. The state government website offered a streamlined online process for registering a new business entity. Paying the filing fee with the remainder of my consignment cash, I typed in my chosen corporate name. Apex Domestic Solutions was born in the dim glow of a computer screen. Receiving a federal tax identification number an hour later sent a rush of adrenaline through my veins. Becoming a corporate entity felt like equipping a suit of armor against the psychological warfare downstairs. My father respected businesses, valuing enforceable contracts and liability clauses over human emotions or familial bonds. Operating as a registered company meant I was no longer a disappointing child begging for gas money. I was a service provider securing a very lucrative long-term client. The most dangerous phase of the plan involved amateur graphic design. Recreating the original timesheet required matching my father's preferred fonts, column widths, and margin spacing. To his rushing, arrogant eyes, the new document needed to look visually identical to the old one. Changing the overarching visual structure would trigger his sharp business instincts and ruin the operation before it even began. Keeping the task tables, the date columns, and the signature line in their exact original locations took hours of careful digital tweaking. The fatal modifications occurred strictly within the fine print. Deleting the header labeled Internal Chore Log, I typed Independent Contractor Invoice. Below the new title, I added the standard commercial billing terms of Net 90. The real poison resided at the very bottom of the page. Tucked beneath the signature line in a microscopic 8-point font, a new paragraph altered the reality of our arrangement. A tiny clause stated that unpaid balances accrued a compounding monthly interest rate. The text also specified that signing the document constituted legal receipt of all contracted services rendered by Apex Domestic Solutions. Which brings us right back to the dining room in Brentwood, Tennessee, and the heavy silver gravy boat. David sat paralyzed, his mouth slightly open, staring at the microscopic print beneath his 50-second signature. The absolute dominance he had maintained for 5 years evaporated in the time it took to read a single paragraph. "You think you're smart?" David hissed, his voice dropping to a low, venomous whisper that barely carried over the hum of the refrigerator. "You think a court is going to enforce this garbage? You lived here. You ate our food. A commercial court won't care about the food, Dad," I replied, my voice cool and perfectly level. "But the IRS will definitely care about the $85,000 in corporate write-offs you claimed using Apex Domestic Solutions corporate billing codes. I've already sent a certified duplicate of these signed invoices to your primary accountant. If you refuse to clear the balance within the Net 90 terms, the automated corporate default will trigger a formal audit request." Eleanor let out a sharp, ragged breath, her hand flying to her pearl necklace. Bethany finally set her phone down on the mahogany table, looking between David and me as if seeing me for the very first time. The twins continued to smear potatoes on the chairs, but no one looked at them. No one ordered me to get a rag. David looked up, his eyes wide with a mixture of rage and absolute financial terror. He was a businessman. He knew when a property was completely lost. Slowly, his hand released the edge of the table. He didn't pick up his wine glass. He just stared at the folder. I smiled. A genuine, warm smile that hadn't touched my face since my startup failed. I turned away from the table, picked up my tote bag from the entryway, and grabbed my car keys. As I opened the heavy oak front door, letting the cool November air wash over me, I looked back one last time. "Don't wait up for the cleaning shift," I said. "Apex Domestic Solutions just dropped you as a client." I stepped out onto the porch, closed the door firmly behind me, and walked down the steps into my new life.